people who and it always seems to come to tumah or whatever and so on. I mean, even Rabbi Akiva, who also was a sherish, he came through. He was a ger. He was an Amoritz basically for 40 years. I mean, who expects him to be a Mashiach, right? Yet he is the responsible. He's the cause of Torah Shabbat Peh. It's beyond belief what this man knew, right? And at 40 years old, he was an Amoritz. I mean, I always like to look at this as God has an incredible sense of humor. Where the least guy you think is Mashiach, he's the guy, and that's why you have Rebbe, they say certain Rebbes are Mashiach. So I once told the guy, well, the fact that you actually say he's Mashiach probably means he's not, because you're expecting him to be in. And the pasuk really is like David Melech's pasuk in Hallel, which we said today. Even moasu haboinim hoisu al ishpino. That's really what it is. The stone that was despised by the builders became the cornerstone. That's what the Mashiach does. The Mashiach conceals this man, so there's no kitrugim. But there's a second reason why, and you now know from the Yalkut. Because the Mashiach ben Yosef, much more than Mashiach ben David, Mashiach ben David doesn't suffer the same way as Mashiach ben Yosef. He suffers in Shemayim, where his neshama is denied access to incredible ore. But that's a spiritual suffering. Mashiach ben Yosef is a physical suffering. He's a real person. Like he says, Leibosav Adama Noichi. He's clearly referring to himself as a real person, right? And I'm suffering. So the Mashiach ben Yosef suffers physically. And I read the Yalkut, the Medrash, right? And you see what the suffering is. It's astounding to watch. It's an oil basel, and that oil basel obviously is metaphoric. It's a metaphor. Doesn't mean he's walking around with a yoke, It'd be interesting to see some guy walking around with a yoke, and they ask him, "Who are you?" It's Mashiach ben Yosef, because it says he's got to walk around with a yoke. Therefore, the reason why we don't see this is because Mashiach ben Yosef doesn't look like the guy. Like Rabbi Akiva was an Amoritz to 40 years old. Would you ever suspect? Imagine you meet him at 39 years old. A 39-year-old guy, he's a middle-aged man, and he doesn't have any prospects, nothing, and this guy winds up to be the transmitter of Torah Shabbat Peh. It's astounding what the Mashiach does, It's the same thing with Avram Avinu at 75. He's an old man at 75. Yet he becomes the forerunner of the whole nation of Israel, which is astounding. Mashiach ben Yosef, he suffers for Klal Yisrael, and therefore it's never apparent of who he is. Because the guy that you meet looks like a regular guy. He's a regular guy, so how would you possibly know who he is? But I want to tell you something, what's important to know. To you, he looks like a regular guy. But he clearly in himself knows that there's something wrong here. Because we're not talking about a guy. I want to tell you something, When Rabbi Akiva became who he was, does that mean he had no potential? He had enormous potential, right? We're not talking about a guy who has like 103 IQ to start off with, We're talking about a guy who had incredible spiritual potential. It was nowhere, right? What was missing was the actualization of that potential. So Rabbi Akiva had to say to himself at some point in his life, what's going on here? I have a great head, I have a great memory, and I have tremendous spiritual proclivities, which means attractions. Why am I an Amoritz? He had to say that to himself. You know what I'm saying? If you think about that realistically, that's the type of person that Mashiach ben Yosef has to be. A guy who has tremendous spiritual potential and is completely blocked. He himself must feel that there's something wrong, that why isn't he successful, and what's happening here? Because like I say, we're not talking about an average guy. We're talking about a guy who has incredible potential. It's a very important concept, I'm telling you. Don't underestimate it. But in any case, and therefore he himself probably suspects, but suspecting is one thing, and being is another. The Mashiach ben Yosef, whoever the guy is, whoever he is, has two phases. There's Mashiach B'Kilkuloi, in his destructive, deformed phase. That's B'Kilkuloi. That's the inyan of the Yisurim that the Yalkut, the Medrash talks about, is the whole Yisurim. And like the Ova said to him, which is amazing, you're greater than us, you see, because the Gzeris on you were terrible, severe, and bad. You see, then they tell that to the Mashiach ben Yosef. So therefore, that's Mashiach b'Kilkuloi. But the Mashiach now, obviously, when he gets the Yechida, is called B'tikunoi. He has a tikkun. You see, he's changed. So the Mashiach ben Yosef has to grow. What am I talking about? Rehabilitation. The Mashiach ben Yosef has to be rehabilitated. People think that all of a sudden some guy's going to be coming, I hate to say it, but riding on a white horse, you know, or maybe driving in a Lexus, a white Lexus. Today it would be a white Lexus instead of a white horse. You take a guy like this, where the office admit that he's much worse off than they are, and it's incredible, right? And you talk about the Moshem, you know, he's screaming, you know, I got to get out of this because I'm dying here. You know what I'm saying? And then all of a sudden, he's released. He's got to go to rehab, right? What's his rehab? That's the question, right? That's fascinating what his rehab is. So his rehab is what? So the Pasuk says what is rehab. So in Yeshayahu, in Nun Beis, Pasuk Yud Gimel, it says over there that the Mashiach, that the nations of the world, in fact everybody, including Jews, are going to look at this guy and say, excuse me, you are Mashiach? I can't believe this, right? And then the Pasuk says, incredible. It says what? Hine Yaskel Avdi, behold, my servant will grow wise. So the servant is a machlokes. Rashi and other Mefoshim say, my servant will grow wise and he will change. Rehab, right? That's Klal Yisrael, which is true. But the Targum says it's Malka Mashiach. It's Mashiach. So it can go on both, but it really goes on Mashiach. Why? Because it says V'yoram, and he will grow. V'niso, and he will grow exceedingly. V'gova mi'oid, and he will become exceedingly high. So the Medrash says on that, what does that mean? Remember, we're talking about the rehab of the Mashiach. B'tikunoi. So V'yora means, and he will become greater than Avram Avinu, which means he will know more than Avram Avinu. Now he will become greater than him. I mean, for that already is like, you know, he's otherworldly. And then it says, V'niso, he will be greater than Moshe Rabbeinu. Now that already is beyond belief. So what's the V'gova mi'oid? He will be greater than the Malachim. He will know more, greater Kedusha, be greater spiritually than the Malachim themselves, while he's living on earth. I mean, you talk about a rehab center, right? That's the Mashiach B'tikunoi. You see? So that's what's going to happen to him. You know what's interesting, and that's in Yeshayahu. So what we see, therefore, is that this is who he is. Now, what's interesting is, I once saw a statement by Rav Kaduri. Rav Yitzchak Kaduri, he was nifter many years ago. He was the greatest of the Mikubolim. He was called the Rosh HaMikubolim when he was alive. He lived to 108 or whatever, with the age he was. A tremendous person. Tremendous Makubal. And he once made a statement, which I saw written, you know, about what he said about Mashiach. So here's what he said. It's interesting, you know. He said, the Mashiach is going to be a person that will become known, not as Mashiach, but somehow his name will get out there. As an unusual person or whatever, you know. And then he's going to disappear from the public. That's what he says, you know. And then he says, and then all of a sudden, he's going to become known again. And slowly, it's going to become more and more apparent who he is. And he says people are going to look at this guy and say, you're Mashiach? I can't believe this. In other words, you're talking about a guy who's, nobody would ever suspect he's Mashiach. You see? And the truth is, you see that. When the brothers came to Egypt, and they finally came to Yosef, right? So Yosef was going to reveal himself. What did he say? Ani Yosef. And they were stunned. That's exactly how the Mashiach is going to reveal himself. Ani Yosef. I am Yosef. That is the viceroy of Egypt. And they were absolutely, like the Torah says, they were just dumbstruck. That's the Gilu of the Mashiach ben Yosef, which is a very important concept. So therefore we see, and now Yosef, he was a viceroy of Egypt. I guarantee you, he looked like an Egyptian. You know, however they walk around, I mean, he's a viceroy, right? Would you ever suspect that an Egyptian that spoke Egyptian, looked like an Egyptian, right? Knew the Egyptian culture, and is the viceroy, that he's the Messiah? Impossible. Yet he was the Mashiach, which is incredible. And not only that, if you think about that, How quick was his revelation? It's amazing, Finally, Paro had a dream, indicates, right? And in one pasuk, he went from the lowest social status in Egypt, which is a prisoner. In one pasuk, Vayiritzu men abor, they shaved him, dressed him, and right in front of Paro. This must have happened in 2 hours. He went from what's called a bor amikta, the lowest pit, to Igur Rama, to the highest roof, in one pasuk. You see, when the Rebbe Shem finally wants to do this, he's not going to dilly-dally. Well, think about it. Maybe I'll give it to a committee. Let them decide, and then we have to take a vote with the committee, right? And then we have to do with the appeals, and all this kind of, no. It happened in 3 hours. He was gone. Just think about that. The koyach of God. Because you figure, how are you going to get out of prison? He needs lawyers. He needs the appellate division, right? And then maybe the Supreme Court to get him out of prison. It's going to take years. With the Rebbe Shem, nothing takes years. In the blink of an eye. And that's what happens. Ani Yosef, nobody knows that this person can even dream about being Yosef, and it happens in the blink of an eye. That's what's going to happen in the end of time. The reason why you'd never suspect, like I said, is because he's got the yoke of which decimates the guy. I mean, who knows what this guy's going through, and decimates the guy and so on. They are involved in something else, and that is ruchnius, spirituality. They need to remove the veil of the spiritual worlds. That's really what the Mashiach are involved with. That's the radical difference. You can have people involved in trying to change the world, through the world, the different, phenomenon and so on. But the messianic figures of Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David is completely different. It's to change the entire perception of the world into spirituality, into ruchnias, where all of a sudden the world sees in the Messianic era what's called the Or Mashiach, the Or Hagonas, the concealed light, the Messianic light, the concealed light. That's what the Mashiach is involved with. Mashiach doesn't bring a political revolution. They bring what's called a spiritual revolution, where the world now realizes that there exists an entirely different spiritual dimension. You see, where do you see this? Because you see this, what's called, in the end of the Torah, when it says, B'chor Shoiroi, when it's talking about the blessings of Yosef, it says, B'chor Shoiroi, the firstborn of his ox. Okay? Hodoloi is beautiful. It says in the Pasuk, by Yosef, B'chor Shoiroi, the firstborn of his ox, right? Hodoloi, he's beautiful. Tremendous hidur of beauty, V'kani re'em karnov, and the horns of this ox, right, is not the horns of an ox. It is the horns of a re'em, which is an animal, a mythical animal, okay, which I will explain. Ubehem, right, v'kani re'em karnov, and that's what his horns are, right. Ubehem, and with these horns, amim yanagach, he's going to gore the nations. You see, that's the pasuk that refers to Mashiach ben Yosef. How? You have to understand what the metaphor is, and that tells you what the job of Mashiach ben Yosef really is. Is that B'chor Shoiroi, the firstborn of his ox. Who's the ox? The ox is the symbol of Yosef. Who is the firstborn? Mashiach ben Yosef. You see, Hodoloi, beauty is his. What does that mean? What that means is this: is that the horns of an ox are what? They're usually what? They're very short, they're very powerful, you see. But the horns of this ox, right, is not the horns of an ox. It's the horns of a re'em. You ever see the horns of a deer? Magnificent, the way the antlers. You ever see an antler, right? The way they shape. It's beautifully aesthetic to look at their horns, So the horns of Mashiach ben Yosef is like not the horns of an ox, strength, but the horns of a re'em. What is the horns of a re'em? And how can the Mashiach ben Yosef have horns? And of course it's a metaphor. What are horns? Horns emanate from the head, right? And they're used as weapons. Therefore, the weapons of Mashiach ben Yosef, the metaphor is horns, right? The weapons of Mashiach Yosef also emanate from his head.
What is that? Chokhmah, wisdom, profound wisdom. That's his weapons, you see. So the horns of the Re'im, the metaphor, is really referring to the wisdom that emanates from the head of the Mashiach ben Yosef. Those are the weapons that he will go the nations. But what do you mean it's beauty, right? Because it's magnificent understanding of the entire reality, because it combines the reality of the physical world with the reality of the spiritual world. It's really Kabbalistic studies and so on, and it reveals a dimension of reality that the world has never seen before, you see. It's the same equivalent, you know what I'm saying? If, a guy who lived in 1840 BCE, and you took him and you put him into, today, 2018, he's never seen this before. You see, this world that we have today is completely concealed from that man. The same idea. Mashiach ben Yosef is going to reveal a reality, all ruchnius, the spiritual worlds, which has never been seen before. And that's his weapon, that he's going to go to the nations. You see? That's the Or Mashiach. So you now understand the difference, that there are two people assigned because of the tshuva that they do, but they are assigned to do the tikkun, to help the Jews do the tikkun, but their job is primarily worldly, to confront the world and try to change the world, and also to assist Israel. But the job of the Mashiach ben Yosef is not a physical fight. He doesn't go to the nations with politics, you see, or economic sanctions. That's not what he does. He goes to the nation, which means he confronts them with an unbelievable chokhmah, and that is the chokhmah of the Or Mashiach, the Messianic light, or the Orishim, the first light. That's what it's also called in the beginning of Adam. Remember that? Or the Or Hagonas. They all refer to the same concept, the concealed light. That's the job, you see. And then Mashiach ben David is what? So Mashiach ben Yosef, his job is basically to bring all the Jews back to Eretz Yisrael, to build the Beis HaMikdash, to gather all the Golos in, and to reveal the Or Mashiach. And then Mashiach ben David is he's the king that will rule over a world that the Mashiach ben Yosef has created. You see? So Mashiach ben David really is a figure that rules over a world that has been changed by the Mashiach ben Yosef. It's been changed by the Mashiach ben Yosef. That's the difference, you see. So really Mashiach ben Yosef, who is a Messiah, a real Mashiach, in many ways is the first stage of the Messianic process. And that's where we're all hoping that the Mashiach ben Yosef shows up. And that's the beginning of the ruchnius, the beginning of spirituality change in the world, of which you have no idea what that means. Look, when God says, I will bring, no matter where the Jews are, in Ha'azinu and in Vayelech and so on, at the end of the Torah, God says, no matter where the Jews are, at the ends of the earth, I will gather them. You see? I will gather them and bring them to me. What that means is not even like gather them, but I will bring them to me and elevate their ruchnius. I will change them and give them a heart, right? Not of stone, but a heart of flesh. That is the whole concept of the removal, what's called the zoyama of the Satan. To remove, because the pollution of the Satan is what makes the man's heart stone, you see. Whereas when you remove the zoyama, the pollution of the Satan, then you are talking about a person that has a human heart, a heart that can feel ruchnius, spirituality. So, you now understand what I meant, that there are four Mashiachs, right? And you understand what it all means, is that when Yishmael and Edom do, Esav does tshuva, which they will do, there will be an evil part of Yishmael and Edom, which I've already identified. But the people who will do tshuva and assist the Tov Sheba Esav and the Tov Sheba Yishmael, right? They in many ways are messianic figures, because they will revolutionize and change the world, their respective worlds. And that's really what's happening. And those two things have been given, like I said, I believe initially they were given to a